At 11:40 p.m., Isabella Rose felt the RMS Celestial's death sentence being written in twisted steel and splintering ice, but what this dismissed third-class passenger whispered to the captain in the next 60 seconds would either save 2,400 souls or damn them all to the bottom of the North Atlantic forever. Get ready to be absolutely glued to your screen for the most incredible story you'll ever hear. Smash that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, share with everyone, and subscribe because this one will leave you speechless. The screaming came from the third-class quarters of the RMS Celestial at exactly 2:47 a.m., but it wasn't the sound of terror, it was the sound of new life fighting to enter a world that would try to crush it before dawn. Isabella Rose pressed herself against the narrow corridor wall as Dr. Peterson rushed past, his expensive medical bag marking him as one of the first-class passengers who'd been summoned below decks for the emergency. She watched him disappear into the cramped cabin where Mary O'Brien was bringing her fourth child into the world with nothing but determination and the help of women who understood that survival was a luxury the poor couldn't afford. 26. Isabella possessed the kind of quiet strength that wealthy passengers looked right through. Dark auburn hair braided practically down her back, intelligent hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and calloused hands that spoke of real work in a world where ladies weren't supposed to know what calluses meant. Her simple brown dress, carefully mended and cleaned, marked her as clearly as a brand among the silk and satin that floated through the upper decks like beautiful ghosts. But Isabella's trained fingers, as they traced the ship's steel walls, could read stories that no first-class passenger would ever understand. The RMS Celestial was singing, not the peaceful hum of a well-built vessel, but the strained melody of metal pushed beyond its design limits. "Another baby born in steerage," muttered Mrs. Flanagan, the Irish woman whose cabin was adjacent to the berthing room. "Poor little thing. What kind of life awaits it in America, I wonder?" "A better one than staying in Belfast," Isabella replied softly, though her attention was focused on the concerning vibrations she felt through the ship's hull. "At least in America, it might have a chance to become something more than what it was born to be." Mrs. Flanagan studied Isabella's face with the shrewd eyes of a woman who'd survived 43 years of poverty and 3 dead husbands. "You speak like someone who knows about wanting to be something more, dear." Before Isabella could respond, the ship's bell chimed midnight, and she felt a change in the Celestial's rhythm that made her engineering-trained mind snap to attention. The vibration pattern had shifted, subtly, but enough to suggest that something in the ship's massive propulsion system was operating outside normal parameters. "I need some air," Isabella said abruptly, gathering her thin shawl. She made her way through the maze of third-class corridors where immigrants slept 4 to a cabin and dreamed of American opportunities, past the barriers that kept the poor separated from their betters, up the steep stairs that led to the boat deck where the night air carried whispers of ice and danger. The North Atlantic stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. Isabella pulled her shawl tighter against the April cold and moved to the railing, where her practiced hands could better read the ship's vital signs through direct contact with her steel bones. What she felt made her blood turn to ice water. Third-class passengers are restricted to designated areas during evening hours. The voice belonged to a uniformed officer whose gold braid and crisp bearing identified him as someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Isabella turned to face him, noting the way his pale blue eyes swept over her simple dress and working-class appearance with casual dismissal. "I'm sorry, sir. I couldn't sleep and thought some fresh air might help." "The ship provides adequate ventilation in steerage accommodations," he replied with the practiced condescension of someone who'd never spent a night in a windowless cabin shared with strangers. "I'm sure you'll find your proper quarters more suitable for your kind." Heat flashed through Isabella's chest, not embarrassment, but rage at the casual cruelty disguised as propriety. "Your kind." As if poverty was a moral failing rather than an accident of birth. "Of course," she said quietly, though every instinct screamed at her to explain what she detected, to warn someone that the RMS Celestial was showing signs of structural stress that could prove catastrophic in rough seas. But who would listen to a third-class passenger with calloused hands and a Belfast accent? Actually, Mr. Hartwell, the lady is welcome anywhere on this ship. The voice that interrupted belonged to Captain William Sterling, and even in her anger, Isabella felt her breath catch. At 34, he was everything a ship's captain should be in 1912, tall and commanding with golden hair and steel-blue eyes that spoke of aristocratic breeding stretching back generations. His uniform was tailored to perfection, and he wore authority like other men wore cologne, naturally and with absolute confidence. But it was his smile that made Isabella's heart skip, warm and genuine, transforming his aristocratic features into something approachable, almost kind. "Captain Sterling," Officer Hartwell stammered, "I was merely enforcing the evening protocols regarding passenger movement, which allow for considerable discretion," William said smoothly, his gaze settling on Isabella with interest that seemed more than merely polite. "Please, Miss Rose." Isabella rose. She extended her hand, acutely aware of her calloused palm. At 11:40 p.m., Isabella Rose felt the RMS Celestial's death sentence being written in twisted steel and splintering ice, but what this dismissed third-class passenger whispered to the captain in the next 60 seconds would either save 2,400 souls or damn them all to the bottom of the North Atlantic forever. Get ready to be absolutely glued to your screen for the most incredible story you'll ever hear. Smash that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, share with everyone, and subscribe because this one will leave you speechless. The screaming came from the third-class quarters of the RMS Celestial at exactly 2:47 a.m., but it wasn't the sound of terror. It was the sound of new life fighting to enter a world that would try to crush it before dawn. Isabella Rose pressed herself against the narrow corridor wall as Dr. Peterson rushed past, his expensive medical bag marking him as one of the first-class passengers who'd been summoned below decks for the emergency. She watched him disappear into the cramped cabin where Mary O'Brien was bringing her fourth child into the world with nothing but determination and the help of women who understood that survival was a luxury the poor couldn't afford. 26. Isabella possessed the kind of quiet strength that wealthy passengers looked right through. Dark auburn hair braided practically down her back, intelligent hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and calloused hands that spoke of real work in a world where ladies weren't supposed to know what calluses meant. Her simple brown dress, carefully mended and cleaned, marked her as clearly as a brand among the silk and satin that floated through the upper decks like beautiful ghosts. But Isabella's trained fingers, as they traced the ship's steel walls, could read stories that no first-class passenger would ever understand. The RMS Celestial was singing, not the peaceful hum of a well-built vessel, but the strained melody of metal pushed beyond its design limits. "Another baby born in steerage," muttered Mrs. Flanagan, the Irish woman whose cabin was adjacent to the berthing room. "Poor little thing. What kind of life awaits it in America, I wonder?" "A better one than staying in Belfast," Isabella replied softly, though her attention was focused on the concerning vibrations she felt through the ship's hull. "At least in America, it might have a chance to become something more than what it was born to be." Mrs. Flanagan studied Isabella's face with the shrewd eyes of a woman who'd survived 43 years of poverty and 3 dead husbands. "You speak like someone who knows about wanting to be something more, dear." Before Isabella could respond, the ship's bell chimed midnight, and she felt a change in the Celestial's rhythm that made her engineering-trained mind snap to attention. The vibration pattern had shifted, subtly, but enough to suggest that something in the ship's massive propulsion system was operating outside normal parameters. "I need some air," Isabella said abruptly, gathering her thin shawl. She made her way through the maze of third-class corridors where immigrants slept to a cabin and dreamed of American opportunities, past the barriers that kept the poor separated from their betters, up the steep stairs that led to the boat deck where the night air carried whispers of ice and danger. The North Atlantic stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. Isabella pulled her shawl tighter against the April cold and moved to the railing, where her practiced hands could better read the ship's vital signs through direct contact with her steel bones. What she felt made her blood turn to ice water. Third-class passengers are restricted to designated areas during evening hours. The voice belonged to a uniformed officer whose gold braid and crisp bearing identified him as someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Isabella turned to face him, noting the way his pale blue eyes swept over her simple dress and working-class appearance with casual dismissal. "I'm sorry, sir. I couldn't sleep and thought some fresh air might help." The ship provides adequate ventilation in steerage accommodations, he replied with the practiced condescension of someone who'd never spent a night in a windowless cabin shared with strangers. I'm sure you'll find your proper quarters more suitable for your kind. Heat flashed through Isabella's chest, not embarrassment, but rage at the casual cruelty disguised as propriety. Your kind. As if poverty was a moral failing rather than an accident of birth. Of course, she said quietly, though every instinct screamed at her to explain what she detected, to warn someone that the RMS Celestial was showing signs of structural stress that could prove catastrophic in rough seas. But who would listen to a third-class passenger with calloused hands and a Belfast accent? Actually, Mr. Hartwell, the lady is welcome anywhere on this ship. The voice that interrupted belonged to Captain William Sterling, and even in her anger, Isabella felt her breath catch. At 34, he was everything a ship's captain should be in 1912, tall and commanding with golden hair and steel-blue eyes that spoke of aristocratic breeding stretching back generations. His uniform was tailored to perfection, and he wore authority like other men wore cologne, naturally and with absolute confidence. But it was his smile that made Isabella's heart skip, warm and genuine, transforming his aristocratic features into something approachable, almost kind. Captain Sterling, Officer Hartwell stammered, I was merely enforcing the evening protocols regarding passenger movement, which allow for considerable discretion, William said smoothly, his gaze settling on Isabella with interest that seemed more than merely polite. Please, miss. Rose. Isabella rose. She extended her hand, acutely aware of her calloused palm. Against his soft skin, the contrast between her working hands and his gentleman's softness. A beautiful name for a beautiful evening, William said, and his smile suggested he actually meant it. I trust you're finding your voyage aboard the Celestial enjoyable, Miss Rose? The question was delivered with genuine warmth, but Isabella caught the subtle emphasis, your voyage, as if her presence aboard this magnificent ship was something remarkable rather than simply the result of saving every penny for 18 months. She's an extraordinary vessel, Isabella replied carefully. Though I couldn't help but notice, the finest achievement of modern shipbuilding, William interrupted with obvious pride. 46,000 tons of the most advanced maritime engineering ever attempted. They say she's virtually unsinkable. Have you ever known something was dangerously wrong but felt powerless to make anyone listen? Share your story in the comments. Isabella's engineering mind recoiled at such hubris. No ship was unsinkable, especially not one showing the metal fatigue patterns she detected through the Celestial's hull responses. But she'd learned through painful experience what happened when working-class women challenged the certainty of powerful men. I'm sure your designers spared no expense, she said diplomatically. The very best minds money could buy, William agreed. Cambridge and Oxford men, naturally. Not like those shipyard workers who think hammering rivets makes them experts on naval architecture. His laugh was meant to be charming, but it hit Isabella like a physical blow. Shipyard workers. Like her father, who'd spent 30 years building ships with his own hands. Like her brothers, who could read stress patterns in steel the way poets read sonnets. Like herself, before she'd been quietly dismissed from the Belfast yards for the crime of being a woman with opinions about structural integrity. Naturally not, Isabella said quietly, swallowing words that burned her throat, that she'd graduated first in her class from Queen's University with a degree in naval architecture before being told her talents would be better suited to appropriate feminine pursuits. That she'd helped design the propulsion systems for vessels larger than the Celestial before being dismissed for questioning a supervisor's calculations that would later prove catastrophically wrong. But Captain William Sterling, resplendent in his gold braid and unshakable confidence, wouldn't want to hear technical concerns from a woman whose dress cost less than his monthly wine bill. Well then, William said, his attention already drifting toward the first-class promenade where elegant ladies in evening gowns strolled like beautiful birds of paradise. Do enjoy the remainder of your voyage, Miss Rose. Remember, you're aboard the safest ship ever to sail. As he walked away toward the world of privilege and possibility that was his birthright, Isabella remained at the railing, her trained hand still reading the troubling messages the Celestial steel was trying to communicate. Messages about stress concentrations and metal fatigue and a ship being pushed beyond the limits her designers had intended. But Isabella Rose was just a third-class passenger, a woman whose expertise had been dismissed by men who confused pedigree with competence. What could she possibly know about ships that Captain William Sterling and his university-educated officers didn't? As it turned out, she knew everything that would matter in exactly 9 hours and 13 minutes, when the RMS Celestial would meet her appointment with an iceberg that cared nothing for social distinctions or the arrogance of men who believed they'd conquered the sea. far below in the ship's massive engine room. Chief Engineer McBride was experiencing the kind of shift that made 25-year veterans question everything they thought they knew about machinery. The Celestial's revolutionary triple expansion engines were performing flawlessly, too flawlessly, creating the kind of mechanical perfection that experienced engineers found deeply unsettling. Something's not sitting right with me about these readings, McBride muttered to his second, a young Scotsman named Campbell who still believed engineering manuals contained all life's answers. All parameters are optimal, sir, Campbell replied, consulting his clipboard. Engine temperature steady, boiler pressure within acceptable ranges, fuel consumption exactly as calculated. And that's what worries me, McBride said grimly. 25 years I've been coaxing music out of ship's engines, boy, and I've never heard them sing this prettily. It's like she's hiding her pain from us. Above them, the Celestial's 2,435 passengers settled into their evening routines, unaware that their fate rested in the hands of men who were beginning to suspect that mechanical perfection might be the most dangerous deception of all in first class, where a single meal cost more than most passengers earned in a month. The wealthy elite discussed investments and social calendars over champagne that sparkled like liquid diamonds. In second-class, middle-class families treasured every moment of their once-in-a-lifetime Atlantic crossing, determined to make memories that would last forever. And in third-class, immigrants and laborers dreamed of American opportunities while sleeping in cramped quarters that would have appalled the ship's designers, if they'd ever bothered to visit. None of them knew that a brilliant woman in a carefully mended brown dress had just detected the first symptoms of the disaster that would test every assumption they held about class, courage, and what it truly meant to be unsinkable. The RMS Celestial sailed on through the star-filled night, her passengers blissfully unaware that they were racing toward a collision with destiny that would reveal who they really were beneath the carefully constructed facades of Edwardian society. And Isabella Rose, dismissed and invisible, stood alone with knowledge that could save them all, if only someone would listen before the North Atlantic claimed its most magnificent prize. The countdown to catastrophe had begun. The collision came at 11:40 p.m. with the sound of dreams dying. Isabella was in the ship's library, one of the few areas where third-class passengers were grudgingly permitted during evening hours, when she felt the Celestial's death sentence being written in twisted steel and splintering ice. The impact wasn't the dramatic crash passengers would later remember, but a long grinding shudder that ran through the ship's bones like a lover's caress turned deadly. But Isabella's trained senses read the disaster in that deceptively gentle contact. The way the ship's vibrations changed from mechanical symphony to mechanical scream. The subtle shift in her trim as thousands of tons of icy seawater began their inexorable invasion. The new harmonic that crept into the engine's rhythm, a note of mortality that made her blood turn to ice. She was running before most passengers even realized something had happened. Through corridors where third-class families slept in blissful ignorance, past the barriers that separated the poor from their betters, up the grand staircase where crystal chandeliers still sparkled as if nothing had changed. Her practical boots echoed against marble steps that would soon be underwater, each footfall marking seconds they couldn't afford to lose. The bridge of the RMS Celestial was a monument to masculine confidence and technological superiority, brass fittings polished to mirror perfection, instruments that promised absolute control over the chaotic sea, and officers who wore their expertise like armor against doubt. Captain William Sterling stood at the center of it all, receiving damage reports with the calm authority of a man who'd never encountered a problem his breeding and education couldn't solve. Even now, with disaster literally flooding through his ship's hull, he looked magnificent. Golden hair catching the electric lights, steel blue eyes focused with laser intensity, uniform immaculate despite the crisis unfolding around him. Captain. Isabella burst through the bridge doors, her brown dress disheveled from her desperate journey through the ship. Captain. You have to listen to me. Every head on the bridge turned toward this third-class passenger who had dared to invade their sanctum. The silence that followed was deafening. The kind of shocked quiet that accompanies a fundamental violation of the natural order. Miss Rose. William's voice carried more bewilderment than anger. What on earth are you doing on the bridge? This area is absolutely forbidden to passengers. The collision, Isabella said breathlessly, pushing past officers who moved to physically remove her. The damage is catastrophic. I felt it through the ship's structure. You have a breach extending at least 400 feet along the starboard hull, probably compromising 6 watertight compartments. The bridge fell silent except for the urgent chatter of telegraph operators and the distant sound of rushing water that seemed to be growing louder by the minute. Miss, First Officer Murdoch said with a patient condescension reserved for hysterical women and confused children, I assure you our damage assessment teams are perfectly capable of determining the extent of any hull breach. Perhaps you should return to your quarters and, your damage assessment teams are reporting from positions where they can't see the full scope of the breach, Isabella interrupted, moving to the ship's blueprints spread across the chart table with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Look, her finger traced along the Celestial's hull design with the precision of an architect. The watertight bulkheads only extend to E-deck. The iceberg's impact angle and the grinding sound duration suggest damage extending above that line, which means water will flow over the bulkhead tops from one compartment to the next. Have you ever felt the moment when everything you thought was safe suddenly became dangerous? Tell us about that realization in the comments. The officers stared at this working-class woman who was discussing naval architecture like she designed the ship herself. Several exchanged glances that clearly questioned her sanity, her propriety, and her right to exist in their rarefied world. Miss Rose, William said slowly, his voice carrying the careful patience of someone addressing a particularly slow child, while I appreciate your concern, I hardly think a third-class passenger is qualified to assess structural damage to a vessel of this complexity. The words hit Isabella like physical blows, but she'd spent her entire life being underestimated by men who confused credentials with competence. She straightened her shoulders and looked directly into William's aristocratic blue eyes. I designed the stress distribution systems for the Olympic-class vessels, she said quietly. The statement landed like a bomb in the elegant confines of the bridge. Officers froze mid-motion. Telegraph operators stopped their urgent transmissions. Even the sound of rushing water seemed to pause in shock. That's impossible, Murdoch said flatly. The Olympic-class designers were all Oxford and Cambridge men. There's no woman listed among the, because I wasn't allowed to be listed, Isabella said, her voice growing stronger as she found her footing in familiar technical territory. I was hired as a computational assistant to Professor Blackwood at Queen's University. My job was to verify his calculations and draft his technical drawings. What I actually did was design the entire watertight compartment system while he took credit for my work. Ship's designer Thomas Andrews, who had been quietly studying damage reports in the corner, suddenly looked up with sharp attention. Miss Rose, are you saying you worked on the bulkhead calculations for ships of this class? I calculated the load-bearing requirements, the water pressure tolerances, and the maximum flooding scenarios that the watertight system could survive, Isabella said simply. Before Professor Blackwood decided that my feminine emotional instability made me unsuitable for such important work and had me dismissed. Andrew's face went pale as he pulled out his own blueprints and began making rapid calculations based on the damage reports they'd received. The scratch of his pencil against paper was the only sound on the bridge as brilliant men grappled with the possibility that their certainty had been built on foundations of sand. After several minutes of intense work, Andrews looked up with eyes that held the hollow look of a man watching his life's greatest achievement become a tomb. Dear God, he whispered. If the damage extends above the bulkhead line as Miss Rose suggests, we have perhaps 2 hours before the forward compartments are completely flooded. The bridge erupted in controlled chaos. Officers began shouting orders with new urgency. Telegraph operators sent increasingly desperate messages into the North Atlantic night. Radio sparks flew as distress signals cut through the darkness, calling for help that was too far away to matter. But through it all, Isabella stood calmly at the chart table, her mind already working on the problem that everyone else was just beginning to comprehend. Captain, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. You need to make a choice. You can waste precious minutes debating whether a working-class woman could possibly know more about your ship than you do. Or you can let me help you save as many lives as possible. William stared at her, this impossible woman who had materialized from steerage to shatter his world with knowledge he'd never suspected she possessed. Everything he'd been taught about social order, about the natural hierarchy that placed men like him in command, screamed that this was wrong. But through the deck beneath his feet, he could feel the Celestial's death throes beginning. Could sense the mathematical inevitability of disaster approaching with each minute that passed while they debated credentials and propriety. What do you recommend? He asked quietly. Isabella moved to the passenger manifest, her finger tracing down columns of names that represented real people, men, women, children who had trusted their lives to this floating palace of steel and dreams. First, we need to be honest about our situation, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. We have lifeboats for 1,178 people. We're carrying 2,435 passengers and crew. Traditional maritime protocol calls for women and children first, but that protocol assumes we have time for orderly evacuation. She looked up at the assembled officers, her hazel eyes blazing with a kind of fierce intelligence that had been dismissed and denied her entire life. We don't have time for orderly. We need to be strategic, or we're going to lose far more lives than mathematics demands. What are you suggesting? Andrews asked, leaning forward with the intensity of a man who recognized true expertise when he encountered it. I'm suggesting we stop following protocols written by men who never imagined a situation like this, Isabella replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. And start thinking like engineers trying to solve an impossible equation with human lives as variables. She moved to the ship's structural diagrams, her finger tracing the Celestial's elegant lines with the familiarity of someone who understood every rivet and joint. The ship is going to sink, that's inevitable now. But we can control how she sinks. We can manage the flooding sequence to buy ourselves time and keep the stern lifeboats accessible longer than physics would normally allow. How? William asked, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice held no condescension, no dismissal, only desperate hope and growing respect. Isabella smiled, and in that moment, she looked like exactly who she'd always been meant to be, not a third-class passenger apologizing for her existence, but a brilliant engineer finally allowed to save lives with a knowledge she'd been forced to hide. By turning this ship into the most precisely controlled sinking in maritime history, she said simply. But I'll need your complete trust and the authority to give orders that will sound insane to anyone who doesn't understand what we're really trying to accomplish. Captain William Sterling looked at this woman who had just revealed herself to be possibly the most qualified person aboard his dying ship. Pride warred with necessity in his chest. His aristocratic upbringing demanded that he maintain command, maintain the proper order of things. But the deck was tilting beneath his feet, and somewhere below, the North Atlantic was claiming his ship one compartment at a time. The ship is yours, Miss Rose, he said quietly. Tell us how to cheat death. And as the most magnificent liner ever built continued her stately slide toward the bottom of the sea, Isabella Rose, invisible third-class passenger turned unlikely savior, began orchestrating the most desperate rescue operation in maritime history. The race against time had begun, and for the first time in her life, Isabella was exactly where she belonged. The first challenge to Isabella's authority came not from the officers on the bridge, but from the wealthy passengers who couldn't comprehend that their social order was sinking along with the ship. This is absolutely preposterous. The voice belonged to Colonel Archibald Gracie, whose family fortune was built on railroad investments and whose military rank commanded respect in drawing rooms from New York to London. He stood in the first-class lounge, his evening dress still immaculate despite the chaos beginning to unfold around them, glaring at Isabella like she was something unpleasant he'd found on his shoe. Isabella had come to the first-class areas to organize the evacuation personally, knowing that every minute counted. But she hadn't anticipated the wall of aristocratic outrage that greeted her attempts to save their lives. Colonel Gracie, she said patiently, her hand steady despite the ship's increasing list, I understand the situation is unprecedented, but we need to get you and your family to the boat deck immediately. The lifeboats on the port side will be launching within the next 20 minutes. I will not be taking orders from a woman, Gracie declared, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd never had his authority questioned. Especially not a woman from, what is it? Third class? This is a matter for the ship's officers, not some hysterical passenger playing at being important. Around the elegant lounge, other first-class passengers murmured agreement. Men in perfectly tailored evening wear and women dripping with jewels that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, all united in their disbelief that someone like Isabella could possibly have authority over someone like them. Mrs. Widener, Isabella turned to address the wife of a Philadelphia millionaire. Please, your children need to be in life jackets now. The water is rising faster than, young woman, Mrs. Widener interrupted with the icy authority of old money. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but I will be taking instructions from Captain Sterling or his officers. Not from, whatever this is supposed to be. Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks, but not from embarrassment, from the rage of watching precious minutes tick away while people chose social prejudice over their own survival. Ma'am, I am giving you instructions on Captain Sterling's direct authority. The ship is sinking. You have perhaps 90 minutes before this entire deck is underwater. Your social position won't keep you afloat. How dare you? Colonel Gracie stepped forward, his face flushed with aristocratic indignation. I've served His Majesty's forces for 30 years, and I will not be lectured by some some governess pretending to know about ships. That's when Captain William Sterling appeared in the lounge doorway, and Isabella felt her heart skip despite everything else happening around them. Even in crisis, even with his world literally sinking beneath him, he commanded attention, tall and golden and radiating the kind of authority that made people stop talking and listen. But when he spoke, his words surprised everyone in the room. "Colonel Gracie, Mrs. Widener, ladies and gentlemen," William's voice carried across the lounge with naval precision, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Miss Rose here knows more about this ship's construction and capabilities than anyone else aboard, including myself. When she gives you instructions, you will follow them exactly and immediately. Your lives depend on it." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella watched the faces around her process this impossible information, that their safety now depended on a woman they'd been trained their entire lives to dismiss. "Captain," Colonel Gracie sputtered, "surely you don't expect us to believe that this person, has any real authority in a maritime emergency." William's steel-blue eyes grew cold. "Colonel, Miss Rose designed the watertight compartment system that has kept us afloat this long. She calculated the stress tolerances that are currently the only thing standing between us and immediate catastrophe. And she's developed an evacuation plan that might save more lives than we have any right to hope for. Have you ever had to defend someone else's expertise when people refuse to listen? Share your experience in the comments." He moved to stand beside Isabella, and she felt the warmth of his presence like a shield against the doubt and disdain surrounding them. "So when Miss Rose tells you to move, you move. When she tells you to put on life jackets, you put them on. When she tells you which lifeboat to enter, you enter it without question. Because the alternative is that we all die together while debating whether a brilliant woman has the right to save your lives." The transformation in the room was immediate and profound. Suddenly, the same people who had been dismissing Isabella were looking at her with new eyes, not yet respect perhaps, but at least recognition that their survival might depend on listening to her. But the real test came when Isabella tried to implement her evacuation plan. "Mrs. Astor," Isabella approached the young pregnant wife of millionaire John Jacob Astor IV, "I need you to come with me to lifeboat number 4. We're loading it from the promenade deck to make the descent safer." Madeline Astor, just 19 and visibly pregnant, looked confused and frightened. "But my husband," Colonel Astor said, "we should stay together. That the men will board the boats after the women and children." Isabella's heart clenched. This was the hardest part of her plan, the part that required her to tell people truths they weren't prepared to hear. "Mrs. Astor," she said gently, kneeling beside the young woman's chair, "I need you to understand something. There aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Many of the men aren't going to survive this night. Your husband knows this. He wants you and your baby to live." The words hit the elegant lounge like a physical blow. Women gasped. Men's faces went pale. The reality they'd been avoiding, that this wasn't just an inconvenience but an actual fight for survival, finally began to sink in. "That's impossible," Mrs. Widener said, her voice shaking. "Ships this size people don't just die." Isabella finished quietly. "Ma'am, ships exactly this size sink. People exactly like us die. The only question is how many we can save if we act intelligently instead of clinging to social conventions that mean nothing to the ocean." John Jacob Astor himself appeared at that moment, his face grave with the knowledge that came from speaking directly with the ship's officers. At 47, he was one of the richest men in America, accustomed to buying his way out of any problem. But money meant nothing to physics. "Madeline," he said softly, his hand finding his young wife's shoulder, "you need to go with Miss Rose. She's going to take care of you." "But Jack, what about you?" Astor's smile was heartbreaking in its tenderness. "I'll follow on the next boat, darling. I promise." It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. But it was the kind of lie that love tells when truth would serve no purpose except to cause pain. Isabella watched the scene unfold, wealth and privilege stripped away to reveal the simple, terrible mathematics of disaster, and felt something crack in her chest. These people, for all their arrogance and prejudice, were about to lose everything. Their certainty, their comfort, their lives. "Mrs. Astor," Isabella said gently, "will you trust me to get you and your baby safely away from this ship?" Madeline looked into Isabella's hazel eyes and saw something that all the money and social position in the world couldn't buy: genuine competence married to compassionate determination. Yes, she whispered. I'll trust you. As Isabella began leading the first group of first-class women toward the boat deck, she felt William fall into step beside her. His presence was both comforting and complicated. This man who had dismissed her hours earlier was now trusting her with everything. Isabella, he said quietly, using her first name for the first time, what you're doing, it's extraordinary. I'm doing what needs to be done, she replied, though she couldn't ignore the way her heart responded to the respect in his voice. Nothing more. No, William said firmly, it's much more than that. You're showing grace under pressure that most of my officers couldn't match. You're making impossible decisions with wisdom that comes from. I don't know where it comes from. Isabella paused at the entrance to the boat deck, where the first lifeboats were being prepared for launch. The North Atlantic stretched endlessly around them, dark and cold and utterly indifferent to human tragedy. It comes from understanding that when everything falls apart, the only thing that matters is what we do for each other, she said simply. William stared at her, this remarkable woman who had appeared from nowhere to save his ship and possibly his soul, and felt something shift inside his chest. Something that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with recognition was falling in love with her. But as the first lifeboats began their descent into the deadly sea, both Isabella and William knew that love discovered in disaster was the cruelest gift of all. Because the mathematics were inexorable, and not everyone who deserved to survive would see the sunrise. The night was still young, and the Celestial had many more secrets to reveal about who people really were when. Everything they thought they knew about the world was washing away beneath their feet. The Celestial's list had reached 15 degrees when Isabella and William found themselves trapped together in the ship's chart room, the heavy steel door jammed shut by the vessel's tortured frame. Outside, they could hear the sounds of controlled chaos, crew members shouting orders, passengers crying, the ominous groan of metal under stress that spoke of a ship in her death throes. The emergency manual release should be here, Isabella said, running her hands along the door frame with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood machinery intimately. But even as she searched, they both knew the truth. The Celestial's twisting hull had warped the doorway beyond any mechanism's ability to compensate. We're trapped, William said quietly, though his voice held no panic. After watching Isabella orchestrate the evacuation with brilliant precision for the past hour, he developed an almost supernatural faith in her ability to solve impossible problems. Temporarily contained, Isabella corrected with a slight smile that made his heart skip despite their dire circumstances. There's always another way out if you know how ships are really built. She moved to the chart room's ventilation grate, her fingers tracing the bolts that held it in place. These maintenance shafts connect to the main air circulation system. We can crawl through to the next section if, she paused, suddenly aware of how close William had moved to help her with the grate. In the dim emergency lighting, his aristocratic features looked almost ethereal, golden hair catching the red glow, steel blue eyes focused on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with their mechanical problem. If what? He asked softly, though they both knew he wasn't really asking about escape routes. If we don't mind getting very dirty and very close together, Isabella finished, her voice barely above a whisper. The ventilation shaft was barely wide enough for one person, which meant they had to crawl single file through a space that forced them into intimate proximity. Isabella went first, acutely aware of William's presence behind her, his breath warm on her ankles as they navigated the narrow passage. Isabella, his voice came from the darkness behind her, I need to ask you something. Now? While we're crawling through the bowels of a sinking ship. Especially now. William's voice carried a vulnerability she'd never heard from him before. When I saw you on the boat deck earlier, organizing the evacuation, the way you held Mrs. Carpenter's hand while her husband helped her into the lifeboat, the way you made sure little Timothy Henderson had his teddy bear before he left his parents. Isabella paused in her crawling, her heart hammering against her ribs. What about it? You weren't just saving lives. You were preserving dignity. Protecting hearts along with bodies. Where did you learn to do that? The question hung in the cramped darkness between them, loaded with meanings that had nothing to do with maritime disaster and everything to do with the impossible connection growing between a working-class woman and an aristocratic captain. From losing everything myself, Isabella said quietly. When the shipyard dismissed me, when my career died because I was born the wrong gender, I learned what it feels like when the world tells you that you don't matter. I promised myself I'd never make anyone else feel that way. They emerged from the ventilation shaft into a storage room that smelled of rope and tar and the clean scent of new canvas. William helped Isabella to her feet, his hands lingering on hers longer than necessity required. "Isabella," he said, and something in his voice made her look up into eyes that held the kind of raw honesty that comes only in moments when death makes pretense impossible. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For every assumption I made about you. For dismissing your knowledge because of your clothes, your accent, your class. For being the kind of man who judges worth by pedigree instead of character." His hands found her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones with reverent gentleness. "For being too blind to see that the most extraordinary woman I'd ever met was standing right in front of me. Have you ever discovered someone's true worth only after you'd almost lost the chance to know them? Share your story in the comments." Isabella felt tears she couldn't afford to shed burning behind her eyes. "William, we don't have time for this. The ship is dying," he said simply. "We both know it. And before she takes us all down, I need you to know that meeting you, seeing who you really are, has been the most profound experience of my life." The storage room around them groaned ominously, reminding them that their world was literally falling apart. But in that moment, with William's hands cradling her face and his eyes reflecting her own desperate hope, Isabella felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt truly seen. "I'm falling in love with you," William whispered, the words tumbling out like a confession he could no longer contain. "I know it's impossible, I know we're from different worlds, I know we may not survive the night, but Isabella silenced him with a kiss that tasted like hope and desperation and the salt spray of the North Atlantic. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together in the dim red light. "I'm already in love with you," she whispered back. "I have been since you defended my right to save everyone's lives. Since you chose truth over pride. Since you became the man I always hoped you could be." The moment was shattered by the sound of rushing water and panicked voices from the corridor outside. Reality crashed back over them like an icy wave. They were still trapped on a sinking ship, still racing against time and physics and the cruel indifference of the sea. "We have to get back to the evacuation," Isabella said, though every fiber of her being wanted to stay in this small space where love had found them against all odds. "I know." William's smile was heartbreaking in its tenderness. "But Isabella, promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that if we don't both survive this night, you'll know that you gave my life meaning. That you transformed me from someone I was ashamed to be into someone I could finally respect." Isabella felt her heart breaking and healing simultaneously. "William, promise me." "I promise," she whispered. "But only if you promise me something too. Anything. Promise me you'll fight to live. That you won't play the noble captain going down with his ship. That you'll remember love is worth fighting for, even when everything else is lost." William's kiss was his answer, desperate and tender and full of promises neither of them knew if they could keep. They found the exit from the storage room and emerged into chaos that had escalated beyond their worst fears. The Celestial's bow was now completely submerged, her grand staircase flooded, her first-class dining room becoming an underwater tomb for crystalline dreams. But on the boat deck, Isabella's evacuation plan was working with mechanical precision. The lifeboats she'd ordered launched were safely away from the ship's death throes, carrying precious human cargo toward rescue ships whose lights were finally visible on the horizon. "Miss Rose." Chief Officer Wilde appeared through the smoke and spray, his face grim but respectful. "The portside boats are all away, and the starboard boats are loading now. But ma'am, we're running out of time." Isabella looked at the deck beneath her feet, feeling the Celestial's accelerating descent into the depths. Her calculations had been optimistic. They had perhaps 20 minutes before the ship's final plunge, not the hour she'd hoped for. "How many people are still aboard?" she asked. "Approximately 400 passengers and crew," Wilde replied. "And we have lifeboats for maybe half that number." Isabella felt the weight of those numbers like a physical blow. 400 people who trusted her to save them. 200 who would die if she couldn't find another solution. "The collapsible boats," she said suddenly, her mind racing through possibilities. "Are they ready for launch?" "They're damaged, ma'am. The falls are twisted, and with the deck angle, we don't launch them from the falls," Isabella interrupted, her voice growing stronger as inspiration struck. "We float them off. When the water reaches this deck, which it will in the next 15 minutes, we float the collapsibles directly off the deck." William stared at her with growing admiration. "That's never been attempted before." Neither has a controlled sinking of a ship this size, Isabella replied with a fierce smile. But if we're going to make history, we might as well make it count. As they raced to implement this desperate final gambit, William caught Isabella's hand in his, squeezing it gently. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "I want you to know that you've been magnificent." Isabella squeezed back, drawing strength from his touch. "We've been magnificent," she corrected. "Together." And as the RMS Celestial prepared for her final act, the woman who had transformed from invisible passenger to unlikely savior prepared to attempt the most audacious rescue in maritime history. Because sometimes, when love finds you in the darkness, it gives you the courage to light the way for everyone else. The water was rising faster now, lapping at the edges of the boat deck as Isabella and William worked frantically to prepare the collapsible lifeboats for their desperate floating gambit. But as they struggled with the ropes and canvas, Isabella's hands began to tremble, not from the cold Atlantic air, but from memories that the ship's death throes had awakened. "Isabella." William noticed her sudden stillness, the way her face had gone pale in the emergency lighting. "What is it?" She was staring at the dark water creeping across the deck, and in its black surface, she saw another night, another disaster, another moment when her warnings had been ignored until it was too late. "I've seen this before," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the dying ship. "Not exactly this, but the water rising, the metal screaming, people refusing to listen until it was too late to save them." William moved closer, his hands finding her shoulders with gentle strength. "Tell me." Isabella's eyes remained fixed on the encroaching sea. "The Belfast shipyard. 3 years ago. I was working on stress calculations for a new cargo vessel, the Prometheus. I found flaws in the hull design, places where the metal would fail under load. I tried to tell my supervisor, Professor Blackwood, but he said I was being hysterically feminine about minor structural variations." Her voice grew harder, edged with pain that had never fully healed. The Prometheus sailed on her maiden voyage with those flaws still in her hull. She made it halfway across the Atlantic before the stress fractures I'd identified tore her apart in a storm. "How many?" William asked quietly, though he already knew the answer would haunt him. 43 souls, Isabella said, her voice breaking slightly. 43 people who died because a man's pride was more important than a woman's expertise. The inquiry blamed unforeseen structural failure. Professor Blackwood was praised for his innovative design concepts. And I was dismissed for emotional instability after I tried to testify about the calculations that could have prevented the disaster. William felt something cold and bitter rising in his throat, the taste of recognition. "Isabella, I became a third-class passenger on this ship because I couldn't afford anything better," she continued, her words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "Because after the Prometheus, no shipyard would hire a woman who'd been labeled unstable. Because I had to sell everything I owned just to buy passage to America, where I hoped maybe someone would give me another chance to save lives instead of watching them be lost to masculine arrogance." The confession hung between them like a bridge made of shared pain. William stared at this extraordinary woman who had just revealed the depths of her scars, understanding now why her eyes sometimes held shadows that had nothing to do with the present moment. "Isabella," he said softly, "I need to tell you something about why I became the kind of man who would dismiss you so completely." She finally looked at him, seeing vulnerability in his aristocratic features that made her heart ache. "My father was Admiral Horatio Sterling," William began, his voice carrying the weight of legacy and expectation. "Third-generation Royal Navy, hero of naval battles from Gibraltar to India. He commanded men, conquered seas, and never once doubted that his breeding and education made him superior to everyone around him. Have you ever carried the weight of someone else's expectations until it nearly crushed who you really were? Share your story in the comments." William's hands found the ship's railing, gripping it as if he could anchor himself against memories that threatened to pull him under. "When I was 12, my father took me aboard his flagship for what he called character building. There was an explosion in the engine room, a boiler failure that killed 6 men and wounded dozens more." Isabella watched his face transform with remembered anguish, seeing the boy he'd been behind the captain's authority. One of the stokers, an Irishman named Finnegan, had been warning about pressure irregularities for weeks. He'd begged my father to shut down the boiler for inspection, said he could hear something wrong in the machinery. But my father dismissed him as an ignorant laborer trying to avoid work. said a man with Finnegan's background couldn't possibly understand the sophisticated engineering that Cambridge-educated officers had designed. William's voice broke slightly. Finnegan died in the explosion, along with 5 other men who trusted my father's superior breeding more than their own instincts. And when the inquiry asked why he hadn't heeded the warnings, my father said that maintaining proper discipline meant not allowing subordinates to question their betters. The parallel between their stories hit Isabella like a physical blow. 2 disasters, 2 ignored warnings, 2 lives shaped by the deadly cost of pride disguised as expertise. That's when I understood what kind of man I was expected to become, William continued. Confident in my authority, dismissive of anyone beneath my station, absolutely certain that education and breeding made me infallible. And I became exactly that man, Isabella. I became someone who would look at your brilliant mind and see only your third-class ticket. Isabella reached for his hands, feeling how they trembled with the weight of confession. William, I spent 22 years becoming my father, he said, his voice raw with self-recrimination. 22 years perfecting the art of being certain about everything while understanding nothing. Until tonight, when you appeared like an avenging angel to show me what real knowledge looks like. What real courage looks like. What real worth looks like when it's not wrapped in gold braid and aristocratic pretension. The ship groaned around them, a sound like the earth itself crying out in pain. The water had reached the base of the funnel now, and they both knew their time was running out in more ways than one. We failed them, Isabella said quietly. Both of us. We failed the people who died because proud men wouldn't listen to inconvenient truths. Yes, William agreed. But tonight, we have a chance to succeed. To save lives instead of watching them be lost. To prove that redemption is possible, even for people like us who carry the weight of the dead. Isabella looked into his eyes, those steel-blue eyes that had once dismissed her so easily, and saw something that made her heart race with more than fear. She saw love. Real, desperate, transformative love that had been forged in the crucible of shared guilt and mutual recognition. If we don't survive this, she said quietly, if the sea takes us both tonight, we'll have died trying to save everyone we couldn't save before, William finished. We'll have died as the people we should have been all along. The water reached their feet then, shockingly cold even through their boots. Around them, the remaining passengers and crew worked with a desperate efficiency of people who understood that every second mattered. The collapsibles are ready, Chief Officer Wilde reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. But Miss Rose, the water's rising faster than we calculated. We have maybe 5 minutes before the Celestial takes her final plunge, Isabella finished. She turned to face the 150 people still trapped on the dying ship, crew members who'd stayed at their posts, passengers who'd helped others into lifeboats, the brave and the unlucky who would share the ship's fate if her desperate plan failed. Listen to me, she called out, her voice carrying across the tilting deck with surprising authority. In the next few minutes, this deck is going to be underwater. When that happens, we're going to float these collapsible boats directly off the ship. It's never been done before, it's dangerous, and some of us won't survive. She paused, looking at faces that ranged from terrified to grimly determined. But some of us will. And if we work together, if we trust each other, if we remember that we're all human beings deserving of life regardless of our station or gender or accent, we can save more lives tonight than anyone has a right to expect. William stepped up beside her, his captain's uniform waterlogged, but his authority intact. Miss Rose will coordinate the evacuation, he announced. Her orders are my orders. Follow them exactly, and you'll have the best chance any of us can hope for. As the North Atlantic claimed the RMS Celestial's boat deck, Isabella Rose, the woman who'd carried the weight of 43 deaths for 3 years, prepared to attempt the impossible. Because sometimes, redemption comes not through forgetting the past, but through using its lessons to save the future. And sometimes, love found in tragedy is the strongest love of all. The collapsible lifeboats floated free from the Celestial's deck like prayers answered by physics, carrying their precious human cargo into the star-filled darkness of the North Atlantic. Isabella's impossible plan was working, against all odds, against maritime precedent, against the cruel mathematics of disaster. They were saving lives that should have been lost. My God, Chief Officer Wilde breathed, watching the makeshift rafts disappear into the night toward the rescue ships whose lights now blazed like beacons of hope on the horizon. It's actually working. We've got nearly everyone off. Isabella stood at the ship's railing, her brown dress soaked with spray and her hair whipping in the Atlantic wind, counting the distant lights that represented lives saved. 47 people in the first collapsible. 39 in the second. 28 in the third, including Mrs. Carpenter and her twin daughters who had refused to leave without their father. "How many are we still carrying?" she asked, though she was almost afraid to hear the answer. 18 crew, 5 passengers who refused to leave, you, me, and Captain Sterling, Wilde replied. 26 souls all told. 26 people still aboard a ship that was settling deeper into the sea with each passing minute. But for the first time since the collision, Isabella allowed herself to feel something that had been absent all night: hope. "The rescue ships?" she asked William, who was studying the approaching lights through his binoculars. "The Carpathia will reach the lifeboat field within the hour," he said, his voice warm with something approaching wonder. "Isabella, do you realize what you've accomplished? By my count, we've saved over 2,000 lives tonight." "We've saved them," Isabella corrected, feeling tears of relief mixing with the spray on her cheeks. "This was never something I could do alone." William lowered his binoculars and looked at her with an expression that made her heart stop. In the glow of the emergency lights, with the stars reflected in the dark water around them, he looked like something from a dream: golden hair disheveled by the wind, steel blue eyes soft with emotions he'd never allowed himself to feel before. "Isabella Rose," he said quietly, moving closer until she could smell his cologne mixed with salt spray, "you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met." "William, let me finish," he said, his hands finding her face with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "6 hours ago, I was a different man. Arrogant, blind, convinced that my breeding and education made me superior to everyone around me. You didn't just save this ship tonight, you saved me. You showed me what real strength looks like, what true nobility means." The ship lurched gently beneath their feet, a reminder that their victory was temporary and their situation still precarious. But in that moment, with rescue so close they could see it on the horizon, with lives saved that should have been lost, Isabella felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt like she belonged exactly where she was. "I love you," she whispered, the words carrying across the water like a vow. "I love your courage, your willingness to grow, the way you chose to trust me when everything you've been taught said you shouldn't." William's kiss was his answer, desperate and tender and full of promises about the life they might build together if they survived the night. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling with more than cold. "There's something I want to show you," William said, taking her hand and leading her toward the ship's stern, where the Celestial's name was emblazoned in gold letters that still caught the starlight. "Something I should have shown you hours ago." They made their way carefully across the tilting deck to a small maintenance area that Isabella had never seen before. William produced a key from his pocket and unlocked a steel cabinet marked Captain's Emergency Navigation Equipment. Inside, among the instruments and charts, was something that made Isabella's breath catch: a leather portfolio filled with technical drawings, stress calculations, and design specifications that bore her distinctive handwriting and mathematical notation. "How did you," she began, but William's smile stopped her mid-sentence. "Professor Blackwood submitted your original designs for the Olympic-class watertight compartment system to the International Maritime Safety Board 3 months ago," William explained. "He claimed them as his own work, of course, but I've seen enough engineering reports to recognize different handwriting styles. These calculations, this level of innovative thinking, they could only have come from one mind." Isabella stared at her own work, her stolen brilliance preserved in the captain's private files. "You knew." "I suspected. But I was too proud, too convinced of my own superiority, to pursue it. Until tonight, when you saved everyone aboard this ship with knowledge that officially didn't exist." William's voice grew soft with regret. "Isabella, you should have been recognized for this work. You should have been celebrated, honored, given every opportunity to continue designing the safest ships ever built. Have you ever had your work stolen or gone unrecognized? Share how you found the strength to keep going in the comments." Isabella touched the drawings with fingers that trembled with more than the ship's motion. Seeing her work, her stolen legacy, somehow made everything else feel possible. "What are you saying?" she asked quietly. "I'm saying that when we reach New York, I'm going to make sure the world knows who really designed these systems. I'm going to use every connection I have, every ounce of influence my family name carries, to ensure that Isabella Rose gets the recognition she deserves." Isabella felt tears streaming down her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming realization that someone finally saw her worth, believed in her capabilities, was willing to fight for her recognition. And more than that, William continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, I'm asking you to marry me. The proposal hit the night air like a flare, brilliant and impossible and beautiful. Isabella stared at this man who had transformed before her eyes from dismissive aristocrat to someone worthy of her love. William, we're from different worlds. We're from the same world, he interrupted firmly. The world of people who understand that human worth has nothing to do with accident of birth and everything to do with character revealed under pressure. Marry me, Isabella. Help me become the man you've shown me I can be. Around them, the remaining crew members were preparing the ship's final boats for launch. The Celestial was settling deeper now, her bow completely submerged, her elegant lines disappearing beneath the star-reflected surface of the North Atlantic. Yes, Isabella whispered, and the word carried across the water like a benediction. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll help you become that man, and you can help me become the engineer I was always meant to be. Their second kiss was interrupted by Chief Officer Wilde, whose face carried news that made Isabella's heart sink. Captain Miss Rose, he said urgently, we have a problem. The final lifeboat, the one we were saving for ourselves, her hull is damaged. She's taking on water faster than we can bail it out. Isabella felt the cold hand of fate closing around her heart. They'd saved everyone else, but in their desperate efficiency, they'd forgotten to ensure their own escape route remained viable. How bad is the damage? William asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. She might keep a few people afloat long enough to reach the rescue ships, Wilde replied grimly. But not all of us. Maybe 6 people. 8 at most. 26 people still aboard. One damaged lifeboat that might save 8. Isabella looked at William, seeing her own terrible understanding reflected in his eyes. They'd won the battle against the sea, saved over 2,000 lives, found love against impossible odds. But mathematics didn't care about love stories. Someone was going to have to choose who lived and who died. And as the RMS Celestial prepared for her final plunge into the abyss, Isabella Rose realized that her greatest test was still ahead of her. Because saving lives was heroic. But choosing which lives to save? That was the burden that would define her soul forever. The moment of truth came when Isabella realized that the mathematics of survival didn't care about love, sacrifice, or the desperate hope that had carried them through the night. 8 people, she said quietly, staring at the damaged lifeboat that represented their only chance of escape. We can save 8 people out of 26. The remaining souls aboard the dying Celestial gathered around the final boat in a circle that felt like a funeral waiting to happen. Crew members who had stayed at their posts all night, passengers who had refused to leave their loved ones, and the 2 people who had orchestrated the greatest maritime rescue in history, all united now by the terrible democracy of impending death. Miss Rose, Chief Officer Wilde said quietly, you and Captain Sterling should be in that boat. You've earned the right to survive this. Earned it. Isabella's laugh was bitter as the Atlantic wind. By what measure? By saving lives while condemning others? By playing God with human souls? William stepped forward, his captain's authority still intact despite their desperate circumstances. Isabella's right. We don't get to choose our own survival over others. But someone has to make the choice about who goes in that boat. The silence that followed was deafening. 26 people, all looking at each other with the terrible knowledge that 18 of them were about to die, and someone had to decide which ones. I'll make the choice, Isabella said suddenly, her voice cutting through the night air like a blade. It was my plan that got us this far. It should be my responsibility to see it through to the end. Isabella, no, William said immediately, but she silenced him with a look that carried the weight of absolute determination. 8 people, she repeated, moving to the damaged lifeboat. Mrs. Hartwell, you have 3 children waiting for you in New York. Get in. Margaret Hartwell, the second-class widow who had lost her husband in the initial impact, stared at Isabella with tears streaming down her face. Miss Rose, I can't. Not while others. You can and you will, Isabella said firmly. Your children need their mother. Get in the boat. One by one, Isabella began making choices that would haunt her forever. The young Irish steward whose wife was pregnant with their first child. The elderly passenger whose granddaughter was getting married next month. The ship's telegraph operator who had stayed at his post sending distress signals until the very last moment. Each choice was a small death, a piece of her soul sacrificed on the altar of impossible mathematics. Tommy Sullivan, she called to a 16-year-old crew member whose face still held the softness of childhood. You have your whole life ahead of you. Get in. Miss, I can't leave me mates. You can and you will, Isabella said, her voice breaking slightly. Because someone has to live to tell their stories. Someone has to remember what they sacrificed tonight. As she continued the agonizing process of selection, William watched with growing horror and admiration. This woman, this extraordinary, brilliant, beautiful woman, was destroying herself to save others, making choices that no human being should ever have to make. Isabella, he said quietly, you should be in that boat. No, she replied without hesitation. My place is here, with the ship I couldn't save completely. You saved over 2,000 lives tonight. I failed to save 18 more. Isabella's voice was steady, but William could see the tears she refused to let fall. A true engineer calculates for all variables, accounts for all possibilities. I should have found a way to save everyone. Have you ever had to make an impossible choice where there was no right answer? Share your experience in the comments. The damaged lifeboat was nearly full now, 7 people huddled together in a vessel that might or might not keep them alive long enough to reach rescue. 7 people who would carry the weight of being chosen, of surviving when others didn't, for the rest of their lives. One more spot, Wilde said quietly. Miss Rose, it has to be you. Isabella looked at the faces surrounding her, crew members who had shown extraordinary courage, passengers who had helped others throughout the night, people who deserved to live just as much as she did. And she saw something that made her decision easier than it should have been. She saw peace. Acceptance. The quiet dignity of people who had chosen to stay behind, who understood that their sacrifice might mean something if it allowed others to survive. No, she said simply. My place is here. Then I'm staying too, William said immediately, moving to stand beside her. William, you have to. I have to nothing, he interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. Isabella Rose, you have shown me what real love looks like. What real courage means. What real worth is. If you're staying on this ship, then I'm staying too. The gesture broke something open in Isabella's chest. This man, this proud aristocratic man who could have claimed the final spot by virtue of his rank, was choosing to die beside her rather than live without her. You idiot, she whispered, but her voice was warm with love and despair and something approaching wonder. You're idiot, William replied, pulling her into his arms as the Celestial settled deeper into her final descent. The damaged lifeboat was lowered into the dark water, carrying 8 souls toward the rescue ships whose lights blazed like beacons of hope on the horizon. Isabella and William watched it disappear into the night, knowing they would never see those people again, never know if their sacrifice had been worthwhile. 18 people remained on the dying ship. 18 souls who had chosen, or been chosen, to stay behind. They gathered on the stern deck as the Celestial's bow disappeared completely beneath the surface, her elegant lines vanishing into the depths that would soon claim them all. I want you all to know, Isabella said, her voice carrying across the deck with surprising strength, that you have been the most extraordinary group of people I've ever had the honor to serve alongside. You stayed at your posts, helped others to safety, and faced death with more dignity than I've seen from people living comfortable lives. Chief Officer Wilde stepped forward, his weathered face creased with something approaching a smile. Miss Rose, if I may say so, it's been a privilege to serve under your command. You've shown us what real leadership looks like. Around the deck, heads nodded in agreement. These people, crew members and passengers, working class and aristocracy, had been united by disaster into something approaching nobility. When the water reaches us, Isabella continued, I want you to remember that we didn't fail tonight. We saved lives. We proved that human beings can rise above their circumstances, their prejudices, their limitations when it matters most. William pulled her closer, his warmth a shield against the cold knowledge of what was coming. Isabella, there's something I need to tell you. What? These last few hours with you, watching you save lives, seeing you become the leader you were always meant to be, falling in love with the most extraordinary woman who ever lived, they've been the best hours of my life. Isabella felt tears finally spilling over, running down her cheeks like the sea spray that was beginning to reach their feet. Mine too. The Celestial's stern rose higher as her bow section filled completely with water. Around them, 18 people prepared to meet their end with a kind of quiet courage that transforms tragedy into something approaching transcendence. And Isabella Rose, the woman who had saved more lives than any maritime disaster in history, prepared to pay the final price for her heroism. Because sometimes, even heroes don't get to survive their own stories. Sometimes, love discovered in disaster is meant to burn bright and brief, like a star collapsing into brilliance before disappearing forever. The water reached the deck, shockingly cold and utterly final. And the most extraordinary rescue in maritime history prepared to claim its last victims. The water was at their ankles when Isabella heard it, a sound that made her heart stop and restart with desperate hope. Steam whistle. Ship's horn. The deep, resonant call of a vessel much closer than the rescue ships on the horizon. "That's not the Carpathia," William said, his voice tight with sudden possibility. "That's the Mount Temple," Chief Officer Wilde finished, raising his binoculars with shaking hands. "She's less than 2 miles out and closing fast." But the unspoken truth hung in the salt air between them. 2 miles might as well have been 200 if they couldn't survive long enough to be rescued. Isabella's mind raced through calculations with the precision that had saved so many lives already. Water temperature, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Survival time in water that cold, 15 to 30 minutes for a healthy adult. Time to rescue, at least 20 minutes, possibly more. The mathematics were brutal, but not impossible. "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through the sounds of the dying ship with surprising authority. "The Mount Temple can reach us, but we have to stay alive long enough to be rescued. That means making choices about how we enter the water, how we conserve body heat, how we help each other survive." Around her, 18 faces looked up with expressions ranging from terror to desperate hope. These people had already accepted death. Being offered life again was almost harder to bear than the original sentence. Miss Rose, Tommy Sullivan, the 16-year-old crew member, said quietly, "What do you need us to do?" Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, not the despair that had characterized the last hour, but the fierce determination that had carried her through a lifetime of being underestimated. "We're going to do something that's never been attempted before," she said, moving to a section of deck equipment that had somehow survived the ship's death throes. "We're going to create a floating support system using the ship's own materials." Have you ever found hope in a moment when you thought everything was lost? Share that experience in the comments. Working with desperate efficiency, Isabella began directing the construction of makeshift flotation devices from deck chairs, life preservers, and sections of wooden railing. Her engineering mind calculated buoyancy and weight distribution, while her hands worked alongside people who had moved beyond social barriers into something approaching communion. "The debris field will help us," she explained as they lashed together anything that might keep them afloat. "When the Celestial goes down, she'll create a spread of floating material that we can use to stay out of the water, at least partially." William worked beside her, his aristocratic hands bleeding from rope burns as they secured their improvised life rafts. "Isabella, even if this works, the cold will kill us if we let it," she finished grimly. "But if we stay together, share body heat, keep moving, we might survive long enough." The stern of the Celestial was rising now at an angle that made standing difficult. Around them, the last remnants of the most luxurious ship ever built prepared to slide beneath the North Atlantic forever. "Positions," Isabella called out as the water reached their knees. "Remember, stay with your flotation device, stay together, and don't give up. The Mount Temple is coming for us." What happened next would be remembered as the most extraordinary survival effort in maritime history as the RMS Celestial made her final plunge. 18 people went into the deadly North Atlantic water clinging to flotation devices they'd built with their own hands under the direction of a woman whose brilliance had been dismissed by the world until this night. The shock of the ice-cold water drove the breath from Isabella's lungs, but she forced herself to stay conscious, to keep moving to hold onto both her makeshift raft and William's hand with grip strength born of absolute determination. Around her, voices called out in the darkness. Crew members helping passengers, passengers helping crew, all barriers of class and station dissolved in the ultimate democracy of shared survival. "Stay together," she gasped through chattering teeth. "Talk to each other. Don't let anyone slip away." Chief Officer Wilde's voice came through the darkness. "Tommy Sullivan, sound off." "Here, sir." Cold but breathing. "Mrs. Patterson." "Present." Holding on to the rail section. One by one, they accounted for each other in the freezing water, 18 souls who refused to let death claim them after coming so far. But the cold was brutal. Isabella felt her strength beginning to ebb, her grip on the flotation device loosening despite her best efforts. Beside her, William was struggling just as hard, his lips blue with hypothermia. "Isabella," he said through chattering teeth, "I need you to know." "Save your strength," she interrupted, though she was barely able to speak herself. "We're going to survive this. Both of us. Together." That's when the searchlight found them. The beam cut through the darkness like divine intervention, illuminating the cluster of survivors who had defied every law of maritime disaster by staying alive in water that should have killed them in minutes. "This is the Mount Temple," came a voice through a megaphone. "Hold on. We're coming for you." What followed was the most precise rescue operation ever executed in North Atlantic waters. Captain Moore of the Mount Temple maneuvered his ship with surgical precision, using steam-powered winches and cargo nets to pull 18 half-frozen people from water that had already claimed so many others. Isabella was one of the last to be pulled aboard, her hands so numb she couldn't feel the rope that dragged her to safety. As strong arms lifted her from the sea, she looked back at the spot where the Celestial had disappeared, seeing nothing but empty water that held the secrets of the most extraordinary night in maritime history. "William?" she managed to ask through lips that barely worked. "Right here," came his voice from somewhere nearby. "Right here, my love." As ship's doctors wrapped them in blankets and force-fed them hot broth, Isabella and William clung to each other with a desperate grip of people who had stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. "We all made it," Chief Officer Wild reported, his voice thick with disbelief. "All 18. Every single person who stayed on that ship, they're all alive." Isabella closed her eyes and felt tears of exhaustion and relief streaming down her cheeks. They had done the impossible. Not only had they saved over 2,000 lives in the initial evacuation, but they had managed to save themselves as well. But as the Mount Temple steamed toward New York with its cargo of survivors, Isabella knew that the real test was just beginning. Because surviving disaster was one thing. Learning to live with the aftermath, with the fame, the questions, the weight of being called a hero when so many others had deserved to survive just as much, that would be the challenge that defined the rest of their lives. But looking into William's eyes, seeing the love and respect and absolute devotion reflected there, Isabella felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt ready to face whatever came next, together. 6 months later, Isabella Rose Sterling stood at the podium of the Royal Institution of Naval Architects in London, wearing a sapphire blue dress that had been tailored specifically for this moment, the moment when the maritime world would finally acknowledge the woman who had revolutionized ship safety forever. The Great Hall was packed with every significant figure in naval engineering, shipping magnates who controlled fleets worth millions, and reporters from newspapers across 2 continents. But Isabella's eyes found only one face in the audience, William, her husband of 3 months, whose love had given her the courage to claim her rightful place in a world that had tried to erase her existence. "Ladies and gentlemen," the institution's president announced, "it is my extraordinary honor to present the Gold Medal for Maritime Innovation to Mrs. Isabella Rose Sterling, chief designer of the revolutionary evacuation systems that saved 2,247 lives aboard the RMS Celestial." The applause was thunderous, but Isabella barely heard it. She was remembering another moment, on a sinking ship in the middle of the North Atlantic, when a different kind of recognition had mattered more than any medal ever could. Have you ever had a moment when you realized that everything you'd been through led to exactly where you were meant to be? Share that revelation in the comments. "When I began my career in naval architecture," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I was told that my mind was unsuited for such work, that my gender made me incapable of understanding the complexities of maritime engineering, that my place was in the home, not the shipyard." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled crowd of men who had built their careers on assumptions about who deserved to be heard. The night the Celestial sank, those assumptions nearly cost over 2,000 lives. It was only when Captain Sterling, my husband, chose to listen to expertise rather than pedigree that we were able to save so many souls from the sea. William felt his chest swell with pride as he watched his extraordinary wife command the attention of the most powerful men in maritime commerce. In the 6 months since the disaster, Isabella had been transformed from invisible third-class passenger to the most sought-after naval consultant in the world. But more than that, she had transformed him from a man who confused breeding with worth into someone who understood that true nobility came from character revealed under pressure. "The Celestial disaster taught us that the sea doesn't care about our social hierarchies," Isabella continued. "Ice doesn't respect class distinctions. Physics doesn't bow to masculine authority. When disaster strikes, the only thing that matters is knowledge, courage, and the willingness to value human life above human pride. The audience listened with rapt attention as Isabella outlined the new safety protocols that had emerged from that terrible night: evacuation procedures that prioritized efficiency over tradition, lifeboat designs that accounted for real-world disaster scenarios, and most importantly, communication systems that ensured warnings would be heard regardless of who delivered them. "But tonight, I don't want to talk about engineering," Isabella said, her voice growing warmer. "I want to talk about love." A murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't the kind of speech they'd expected from a technical presentation. "Love," Isabella repeated, her eyes finding William's across the crowded hall, "is what saved those lives. Not my calculations or Captain Sterling's authority or the crew's training. It was love, love for strangers, love for humanity, love for the simple truth that every life has value regardless of the accident of its birth." She moved away from the podium, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Love is what made Chief Officer Wilde stay at his post to help others evacuate. Love is what made Mrs. Astor trust a third-class passenger with her life and her unborn child's future. Love is what made my husband choose to believe in my expertise when everything he'd been taught told him not to." William felt tears burning behind his eyes as he watched the woman he adored transform a room full of skeptical engineers into people who understood that technical brilliance meant nothing without compassion. "6 months ago, I was nobody," Isabella said simply. "A failed naval architect working as a cleaner to afford passage to America. Tonight, I stand before you as the chief designer for Sterling Maritime Corporation, the wife of the most extraordinary man I've ever known, and the mother of the child we're expecting this winter." The last revelation brought gasps from the audience and a smile of pure joy from William, who had been bursting to share their news with the world. "Our child," Isabella continued, her hand moving instinctively to the slight curve of her abdomen, "will grow up in a world where worth is measured by character, not credentials. Where brilliant minds are celebrated regardless of their gender or background. Where love, real, transformative, world-changing love, is recognized as the most powerful force in human experience." She returned to the podium, her voice growing quiet but somehow more powerful. "The Celestial lies at the bottom of the North Atlantic, along with the old world's assumptions about who deserves to be heard. In her place, we're building something new: ships that are truly safe, companies that value expertise over pedigree, and marriages that are partnerships between equals who see the best in each other." Isabella lifted the gold medal, feeling its weight as both honor and responsibility. "This award doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to every person who stayed calm in crisis, who put others before themselves, who chose love over fear in humanity's darkest hour. It belongs to the 2,247 souls who survived that night, and to the memory of those who didn't." The standing ovation lasted for 10 minutes, but Isabella barely noticed. She was looking at William, at the man who had grown from dismissive aristocrat into the kind of partner she'd never dared to dream possible. Later, as they walked through the London streets toward their hotel, William pulled Isabella into his arms beneath a lamppost that cast golden light over her radiant face. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, using the title that still made her heart skip, "you were magnificent tonight." "We were magnificent," she corrected, the same words she'd spoken on a sinking ship when their love was first discovered. "Together." "Always together," William agreed, his hands finding the gentle curve where their child was growing. "This little one is going to have the most extraordinary mother in the world." "And the most extraordinary father," Isabella replied, thinking of how completely William had transformed from the man she'd first met. A father who learned that true strength comes from recognizing the worth in others. They kissed beneath the London stars, two people who had found each other in tragedy and built something beautiful from the wreckage of Disaster Point. 6 months later, Isabella Rose Sterling would give birth to Elena Margaret Sterling, who would grow up to become the first woman to captain a passenger liner across the Atlantic. 20 years after that, Elena would stand at her own podium, accepting recognition for innovations that had eliminated maritime disasters entirely. But tonight, as Isabella and William walked through London as partners in love and life and the revolutionary work of building a better world, they were simply two souls who had learned that the most powerful force in human experience wasn't engineering or authority or social position. It was love, real, transformative, world-changing love that saw past surface to substance, that chose growth over pride, that recognized that the most extraordinary people were often the ones society had tried hardest to ignore. The RMS Celestial had taken her secrets to the ocean floor, but she had left behind something far more valuable than gold or jewels. She had left behind proof that when disaster strips away everything artificial, what remains is the simple, Profound truth that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they choose to love each other across every barrier that separates them. And sometimes, just sometimes, love really is enough to change the world. This incredible story of courage and heroism inspired you. Hit that subscribe button for more amazing tales of people who changed everything when it mattered most.